So I was going to talk about the Anti-Terrorism Act and some aspects of how it's affected Indigenous resistance, or how the state represses Indigenous movements. But before I started talking about the Anti-Terrorism Act, I thought I would try to give like a bit of history context for these types of this type of state legislation repression. So before we had the Anti-Terrorism Act, back in the day, we had the War Measures Act, which was used in World War I and World War II and during the 1970 October crisis. And the War Measures Act is basically the imposing of martial law over Canada, in which the state took control of and imposed like a wartime economy. They took over industrial production. They decided what would be produced and how much would be produced. They took control of housing, had rent control. All types of aspects of society were they gave themselves the authority to take and expropriate, land, vehicles, and whatever. And one thing I found interesting about this was after the 1917 Russian Revolution, they actually added some new regulations to the War Measures Act that had been enacted in 1914 or something, and banned membership in communist and socialist organizations, their publications and whatnot as well. And during World War I and World War II, while the state was imposing this wartime economy and taking control of all the social networks and whatnot, they also interned thousands of civilians that they designated as enemy aliens. So during World War I, this included a lot of Ukrainians, and then during World War II, it was Germans, Italians, and Japanese. And then in 1970, so those were temporary measures. And then in 1970, of course, we had the October crisis when the Quebec Liberation Front had kidnapped the British diplomat and a high-ranking Quebec minister who was assassinated. And so the Liberal government under Pierre Elliott Trudeau enacted the War Measures Act and basically imposed like martial law over the country, even though it was mostly restricted to Quebec and in particular Montreal. And there was about 456 people arrested, most without charge. And there was a lot of banning of publications and whatnot. So there was somewhat of a backlash against the use of the War Measures Act for this, not insignificant, but not really like a war type of situation in how the state dealt with the Quebec Liberation Front and its actions. And so there was discussion about revising this and making some kind of new legislation to deal with these types of national emergencies or threats to national security, but without invoking the War Measures Act. And in the late 1970s, there was, I think it was the MacDonald Commission, which was investigating the activities of the RCMP's kind of dirty campaign against the Quebec separatist movement in the 60s and early 70s. And so one of the recommendations out of that was to come up with some kind of new legislation so that they wouldn't have to use the War Measures Act. And they also recommend the separation of the intelligence, the security service from the RCMP. And that's eventually how we got CSIS, the Canadian Security Intelligence Service. But it wasn't until 1988 that a new legislation was enacted, and that's the Emergencies Act, which replaced the War Measures Act. And it has different levels. Like there's one for like if there's a domestic emergency, like a terrible winter storm or flooding or natural disasters in this, then there's the public order aspect of the Emergencies Act, which could be used when, the national security is threatened by, sabotage or widespread civil disobedience or something, whatever. But this gave the state a lot of powers when it was going to be enacted. And the first time we saw it used was in 2022 against the Freedom Convoy in Ottawa. And this gave the state the powers to, remove all the protesters, take their vehicles, and it was also they're also dealing with the other blockades at the Coutts border crossing and the Windsor border crossing to the U.S., which was costing billions of dollars because they blockaded those as well. But that's like the Emergencies Act. And then after 911, of course, as Elena talked about, we had the introduction of the new Anti-Terrorism Act in 2001. It was passed in December 2001, just a few months after the September 11th attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. And this gave the state fairly broad powers as a part of the criminal code now, without enacting an Emergencies Act or without, enacting any kind of emergencies legislation. And it covered a lot of different aspects. And it's basically a counterinsurgency law because it's not dealing with a war between states. It's dealing with these small groups. So it's basically a counterinsurgency law. And it covers a lot of aspects of a counterinsurgency. So it had preventative arrests for people who are suspected of going to be committing some kind of offense. Then it had financial aspects so that their bank accounts and all their funding could be frozen, and immigration status and stuff like this. So it covered a lot of different aspects. There was sunset clauses in it for some of the aspects of the new legislation that the state probably felt would get the most public criticism. So there was a sunset clause of 3 to 5 years. And those actually lapsed. I think one of the governments tried to extend those sunset clauses. But in 2015, there was new legislation, the Combating Terrorism Act, which basically revamped some of those sunset clauses. And there was another one, I'll just look at my notes. Yeah, the Combating Terrorism Act was in, actually it was in 2013, and there was a new Anti-Terrorism Act in 2015, which extended the preventative detention from 3 days to 7 days. And it also greatly expanded the powers of CSIS and empowered them to get these threat disruption warrants. So that, because CSIS was originally only intelligence gathering, and they would make their reports and recommendations, and they had no powers to arrest or anything like that. That was one of the recommendations from the McDonald Commission and why CSIS was formed. And so it had a really specialized thing, and it couldn't arrest people. It had to work with the RCMP. But there was it's a whole other subject, but there was so much animosity between the RCMP and CSIS. It's kind of legendary. But so this 2015 revision of the Anti-Terrorism Act gave CSIS new powers to disrupt, threats. So they could cancel people's travel plans or, just different things like that, cut their communications and stuff like that. And all of this has greatly expanded this national security state that was kind of in development over the years, but it's become much more entrenched now, I think. And this terrorist designation list, they call it the listed entities. Most of them are Islamist groups, and you have a sprinkling of far-right white supremacist groups like the Proud Boys, Blood and Honor, the Three Percenters, and these seem like, not to downplay the threat of these groups and some of the actions that they've carried out, like murder and assaults and whatnot, but they're like one of the Three Percenters, because of some of the activities in the United States. But in Canada, it's been a very a very minor player. I mean, I think there was a few members in Alberta and whatnot. The Proud Boys. I mean, I think that designation came after the January 6th Capitol riot, but a very, very insignificant minor player in Canada. And so it really does seem like they're throwing in these groups, and so they can say, well, this isn't just an anti-Muslim category or a list, but you have these other groups. And the Samadin uh, listing is probably the most unusual of all the groups you can look at, because they don't take any action. Like they're not like the base, the neo-Nazi organization that does military training, and its members have been convicted for these attacks in the United States and whatnot. So it's definitely a very peculiar designation, I think. But I'll just talk briefly about the Indigenous experience with the state repression. So one of the things after the Anti-Terrorism Act of 2001 was passed, the RCMP created the Integrated National Security Enforcement Teams that are known as INSET. And they're in like Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver. I think that's where they have offices. So the first acts, like, so this group is, they're established because of this whole anti-terrorism, global war on terror. And yeah, their first targets were on Vancouver Island. The first operation they did was against the animal rights activists. And then the second one was against the West Coast Warrior Society. And they raided these people's homes and whatnot. So it does kind of show the real, the potential of where these acts can actually be applied. Now, in terms of like Indigenous resistance, to me, it's like interesting because on the one hand, you have had these very significant acts of resistance coming from Indigenous people, such as the 1990 Oka crisis and the 1995 Chapatan standoff or Gustafson Lake standoff. So both of these are like armed standoffs. Oka in particular had dozens of armed warriors and thousands of police and thousands of soldiers mobilized. But they never invoked the Emergencies Act for that. They just used a section of the National Defense Act to authorize the deployment of the military for this domestic policing operation. And then the same with the Chapatan standoff in 1995 in the BC interior. They didn't invoke the Emergencies Act. They just used a section of the National Defense Act to authorize the deployment of the Bison armored personnel carriers and the supplying of weapons and ammunition and whatnot. And even with, Shut Down Canada, I thought was a pretty strong action. It cost, tens of millions of dollars in, lost economic production, and, the trains weren't running in some areas and whatnot. But again, there was no effort to use the Emergencies Act. And it just shows, like, I think it's interesting to look at it because it shows a reluctance on the part of the state to use this type of legislation or even designation against Indigenous resistance, even though according to their definitions of terrorism, some of these actions would fall under that. And in fact, you can look at in 2006, the Canadian forces, because they're involved in the invasion of and occupation of Afghanistan, they came out with a revised counterinsurgency manual as a part of their how to train their soldiers for these types of operations. And they had a draft version of the manual, and it had included discussion of the Mohawk Warrior Society as an example of an insurgent group that is an example of when a counterinsurgency campaign might be used. And there was a bit of a protest about that, and then the military removed any reference to Mohawk Warrior Society from the manual. It had reference to like Hezbollah and the Taliban, for example. So they removed the Mohawk Warrior Society, and then a few years later, they actually moved to make an official apology to Indigenous people because of that little slip up or whatever. But I think it shows that they don't have the political will to try to use this legislation on movements or uh, parts of the population that they think is going to create significant, political problems for them if they try to use these types of designations. Um, and I think that's kind of, it's an important uh, thing to understand about these anti-terror legislation. And also, the Anti-Terrorism Act of 2001 was in many ways modeled on the British because it's also an advanced industrialized nation state that was having decades of counterinsurgency operations in Northern Ireland. And the British had passed the Prevention of Terrorism Act in the 1970s. And that had a lot of the same types of provisions that we see in the Anti-Terrorism Act. Um, and so I think that's like an area that people should also look at in terms of understanding how this type of legislation is used in a counterinsurgency kind of like campaign, because that's really a model that a lot of these so-called Western democracies looked at, because Northern Ireland was always a laboratory for counterinsurgency, whether it's tactics or weapons and whatnot. But so the Prevention of Terrorism Act, I think, is very something that should be looked at. And also the British anti-terrorist legislations that came out in the 1990s, and how the social movements responded to this type of legislation as well. I think there could be lessons learned from that. But yeah, it's like the state doesn't need to use something like the Emergencies Act because it already has legislation that empowers it to disrupt social movements to a very high degree. I think this Palestinian solidarity movement is something that obviously the Western imperialist powers are very threatened by, and that's why you see this such outrageous demonization of the movement, and now the application of the anti-terrorism, terrorist entity list on a Palestinian prisoner solidarity group. I think shows how threatened the state is by this solidarity movement. I mean, it's unprecedented, I think, and definitely, I think it is going to be it's a really important movement that's going to have profound impacts because like tens of thousands of young people have been, I think, radicalized through this movement, and I think that's partly why we're seeing this type of state repression being brought down on it.